How you doing, love?
It's a cultural genocide that's happening in Labrador because of the actions of this project.
The controversial hydro project at Muskrat Falls has sparked fear, protests, outrage.
This was a story that had to be told.
Dozens of people face charges.
It's going to wipe out my traditional food as an Inuit person. And for me to be told that I can't protest that, that is injustice.
The colonial legal system says to me that my way of life is illegal.
But we're dealing with a corporation that has singled out a journalist, is targeting a journalist.
You hurt me!
Many Innu and Inuit say reconciliation and sunny ways are nowhere to be seen in the shadow of the dam.
If there was reconciliation, I wouldn't have gone to prison.
I've cried tears with this river. I've spoken with this river. I've prayed with her.
Denise Cole, Inuk, waterkeeper, Labrador land protector, titles all tied to the Churchill River.
It's an incredible part of me.
The Innu and Inuit call this Grand River.
I never understand how people can look at it and think of money and hydro dams.
Cole says the buzzwords around Canada's new relationship to Indigenous people, reconciliation, free, prior and informed consent, nation to nation, don't hold much water here.
I have no faith in this TRC calls to action that this country is going to, actually do what's right by the people in this country. And Muskrat Falls for me is the biggest example of that because, of course, it's right in my backyard.
In 2006, the government of Newfoundland and Labrador decided to tap the power of this river at Muskrat Falls, with Nalcor Energy, a provincially owned corporation, at the helm. The headlines reflect the controversy. Fears of flooding, a lack of consultation, a mismanaged project. The price tag has skyrocketed from $6 to $12 billion.
It was full speed ahead with the boondoggle from day one.
Former leader of the NDP in the province, Earl McCurdy, has been a vocal critic of Muskrat Falls.
It was rammed through in the first place, and the current government just carried on with a little bit of tinkering on some of the details, but fundamentally no change to the approach to the project. It's a huge issue because it casts a shadow over the future of our province from the point of view of our environment, of the economy.
But dams are a key part of Canada's climate change action plan. Hydropower provides over 60% of the country's electricity.
This project has been beset by difficulties, cost overruns, and delays. The project has been in trouble. The project, however, carries the potential of providing clean electricity to Newfoundland and Labrador and throughout Atlantic Canada.
Clean energy, but at what cost?
My culture is at stake. Right? My culture, my Inuit culture.
Marjorie Flowers lives in Goose Bay now, but grew up in the Inuit community of Rigolet.
We ate salmon all summer long and trout. It wouldn't be a summer for me if I didn't go get my salmon. So it was really important and remains important. It's so important.
Traditional foods could be at risk. A study by Harvard researchers predicts that Muskrat Falls could poison the waterways. Trees and topsoil left in the reservoir when flooded naturally create methylmercury. The neurotoxin flows downstream, it contaminates traditional food sources, and can make people sick.
This is the way I grew up. This is what I lived on. To have that in jeopardy, because it is in jeopardy now, it becomes like a strip off of me.
Make Muskrat right! Make Muskrat right! the lives of the Labrador Inuit are more important than money.
As the deadline for the first phase of flooding loomed in the fall of 2016, demonstrations picked up steam, with demands that Nalcor clear the reservoir first.
The amount of methyl mercury that will come into our waters, our way of life will be gone.
The people of Labrador have the Newfoundland government on the run, and we're not going to back down from that. No damn way!
The sense of urgency set in, the protests grew, and I stayed, and I was on the ground for all those protests.
There's an injunction order right here. Back there.
Nalcor was granted a court injunction on October 16th. A day later came the first arrests.
You hurt me! You hurt me!
My rights as an Inuit person here in Labrador have been trampled on. Trampled into the ground. I don't have that anymore. I don't have that same power.
Those initial arrests, as a result of that injunction, seemed to backfire for Nalcor if the goal was to try to quell the protests.
Journalist Justin Brake covered what was happening for the Independent.ca. He now works for APTN.
To be able to live stream the actual events that were unfolding was important because it countered the narrative that often goes along with protests, especially Indigenous-led protests.
On October 22nd, a group of land protectors broke past the gates.
And they broke a fence. Within seconds, there were dozens of people. I estimated 50, 60 people went through the gate.
The group took over the building where Nalcor workers eat and sleep on site.
That's Kurt Lethbridge explaining the intentions of the group.
My main concern is the methyl mercury levels, which rumors are saying that they're starting to flood today.
I just kind of wanted to be here so I could help keep my culture and my traditions alive. Like, if I can't eat salmon and char and many other things, I'd be devastated.
About 50 people and several vehicles breached the main gate.
Flowers, who had been arrested the week before, was part of the occupation.
This issue was and still is way too important to be swayed by a court injunction.
Labrador strong.
After 5 days, Indigenous leaders made a deal with the Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador to mitigate the impacts of methyl mercury.
It is significant. It is meaningful.
The occupation of Muskrat Falls ended.
I was really naive. I got excited and happy because I thought we would finally have our voices being heard.
My disclosure, this is what they got against me.
A year later, what felt like a victory has turned into an endless series of court dates for over 50 land protectors like Beatrice Hunter.
The reality now is we're still trying to get heard, and we're still trying to save our own lives. No, I don't feel reconciliation at all.
Abducting is not a crime, man.
There's no justice in this project, and there's no justice in any of that court action.
Right.
If he would have come and had a conversation with us, this would have been ended a long time ago.
When we come back.
To Nalcor CEO Stan Marshall, we say directly, make your engineers explain publicly why the methyl mercury agreement has been broken.
It's early morning in St. John's.
I know we all have lots of reasons to be frustrated with Nalcor, with this province, and with this government.
Denise Cole is in town and has led a group of land protectors to Nalcor Energy's head office to keep workers out to get her message across.
To Dwight Ball, the Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador, as well as to Nalcor CEO Stan Marshall, that it's not okay. It's not okay to poison people downstream with methyl mercury. It's not okay to try to bankrupt this province.
The group wants to meet with Nalcor Energy's CEO Stan Marshall.
Drop the court injunction against peaceful protectors in Labrador. Stop acting like you cannot.
Nalcor calls the police.
So how they've chosen to handle this situation has led to, instead of us having a conversation with employees of a Crown Corporation that we own, instead I have to have a conversation with an RNC officer.
So I'm going to be asking you guys to leave or allow them to walk into the building.
Is there a possibility that you can go and tell Stan Marshall, who's up in that parking lot, that we would like to have a conversation with him?
Cole doesn't get to speak with Stan Marshall. The CEO didn't grant APTN an interview either. Neither did Premier Dwight Ball.
And this fall, an inquiry into Muskrat Falls will officially be called.
Ball inherited the project from the previous government and says he promises to get to the bottom of the Muskrat Falls fiasco.
Whatever it takes to get the answers that people rightfully deserve. I'm concerned about the future of this province.
All premiers live or die on resources with the strength of their relationship with First Nations.
Bill Gallagher is a lawyer and author with a history of work in the resource sector, from Voisey's Bay to Alberta's oil patch. Gallagher says 247 landmark legal wins for First Nations in Canada makes them what he calls resource rulers, a lesson Canada is slow to learn.
Because if you're trying to bring a mega project online in Canada today in the face of Native opposition, it's probably not going to happen.
But the government of Newfoundland and Labrador has said with billions of dollars tied up in contracts, it's too late to stop Muskrat Falls. It means expensive electricity for people in the province.
And is slated to be wheeled into, hopefully, the New England market, where this project has received withering criticism in the New York Times and the New Yorker magazine over its treatment of Indigenous rights. So it's poisoned the well in the marketplace for how it's ever going to recover its revenue streams.
And many are still concerned Muskrat Falls will poison the waterways. A year after the deal with Indigenous leaders, the reservoir is partially flooded, and work of the promised committee to monitor and help mitigate methylmercury was late starting. It has come up with recommendations and says there's still time. But for many, there's also deep mistrust.
They're not taking concerns seriously. We're here waiting for mitigation of methylmercury poisoning.
And a year later, Inuk grandmother Beatrice Hunter is still tied up in court, one of dozens facing civil and criminal charges, and one of 4 land protectors sent to jail.
It was the scariest moment in my life.
Hunter, along with Eldred Davis, Jim Learning, and Marjorie Flowers, refused to promise a Supreme Court judge they would follow the court order to stay away from Muskrat Falls. That defiance amounted to contempt of court.
But I knew it was the right thing to do because our voices weren't being heard, and they're still not being heard.
Hunter spent 11 days in a St. John's prison.
I was angry that I had gone to jail and Muskrat Falls is still running.
I was hurt in so many ways because they keep doing their thing, and that's from so many angles. They are hurting us. And here I was in jail. In jail. I was in jail. I felt and I know that I didn't do anything wrong. I broke a piece of paper. I mean, I went against that order of the court for a piece of paper that had no validity in my eyes, in my perspective as an Inuit woman. And I'm not allowed to speak anymore. It is so frustrating. It is so hurtful. It is so painful. It is so despairing.
It would be difficult to argue that injunctions, would not impede reconciliation. Unless reconciliation includes the criminalization of Indigenous people trying to defend their rights and their land and things like traditional foods.
When land protectors stormed the Nalcor site, Brake followed.
Hi, Justin Brake here again with the Independent. We're back in cell phone range here. I have a strong enough signal to live stream again.
When the court named individuals on the injunction, Brake's name was there.
If corporations can get away with targeting journalists, especially journalists who are covering important stories like Indigenous-led resistances, in a time of reconciliation, then we certainly don't have press freedom in Canada. But what precedent could it set?
Brake is facing civil and criminal charges, including breaking a court order and mischief over $5,000. APTN is an intervener in Brake's civil case because of the potential implications for press freedom. Covering Indigenous issues is vital to APTN's mandate, from Elsipogtog and fracking to pipelines and Standing Rock.
This isn't nothing new for Native people.
I often think that our relationship is often seen through the prism of natural resource development or major projects happening on Indigenous lands where Indigenous peoples aren't respected, where our rights are not taken into account. You're the ones who's going to have to carry the traditions.
Former Liberal MP Todd Russell is president of the Nunatukevet Community Council, representing Southern Inuit in Labrador.
Trying to get people to respect the fact that we're here, we're not going anywhere, and this project is on our lands. Our rights as Indigenous peoples were also in play here.
Russell was arrested during a protest in 2013. He fought a previous Nalcor injunction in court and had it thrown out.
It's a very colonialistic reaction to Indigenous protests. Somehow they see it, the other governments, corporations see it as an affront to their authority or their rights.
Now he's going back to court to try and amend the current injunction.
It is not killing the injunction altogether. It is coming up with a set of reasonable conditions so that people can protest, exercise their charter rights and freedoms like any other Canadian.
But many want it dropped altogether, like Eldred Davis, who went to jail for defying the injunction. He's using his time in court now to challenge it.
The overwhelming factor for me is the fact that Nalcor should not have gotten it. They don't deserve it.
5, 6, 7, 8. Shut her down. It's not too late.
Nalcor was granted the injunction to prevent what's called irreparable harm. Protests cause delays, delays cost money. Davis says to him, the irreparable harm is to people downstream.
And yet those people who are voicing their opposition to this and demonstrating and protesting against this are the people who are being prosecuted.
This is a project, as you know, that we inherited from the PC administration.
Ball wasn't premier and Stan Marshall wasn't CEO for much of the life of the Muskrat Falls project. But the latest court injunction, as a reaction to Indigenous concerns, happened on their watch.
If you're relying on lawyers and their legal toolbox to put everybody back in their place, you're going in the opposite direction from reconciliation.
People here are looking beyond Nalcor and the province for answers. At the peak of the protests last year, while land protectors rallied at Nalcor's gates in Labrador, Inuit hunger strikers took their protest to Ottawa.
You can't break us. Nobody can break us.
What is the Prime Minister doing specifically to address the concerns raised by Inuit and Innu about poisoning of their fishery with methyl mercury? What is he doing?
An honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the relationship with Indigenous peoples is extraordinarily important for this country, based on respect, based on science, based on partnership, and that's why we are ensuring that the province continues to consult and engage on this project with the full respect that we all expect will be shown towards Indigenous peoples in this country.
We're here for reconciliation.
At the same time, back in St. John's, Todd Russell was part of that marathon meeting with the Premier.
I believe that the federal government had been given some assurances that some of the relationship pieces with Indigenous peoples was being addressed. And so, yes, I think there was a lot of pressure. I think there were a lot of considerations in that particular room at that particular time. Protests will have to end. And at the end of the day, what usually most of these end with negotiations or the end with agreements.
A week after the Premier made the deal with Innu and Inuit leaders, Trudeau's Liberals announced $2.9 billion in federal loan guarantees for Muskrat Falls. Denise Cole says in a project fraught with Indigenous concerns and court actions, money speaks louder than buzzwords around reconciliation.
The methylmercury, something had to be done about that for Canada, the government of Canada, to save face, that they weren't going to poison Indigenous downstream people and an Indigenous food chain while they talked about truth and reconciliation. So in helping the provincial government in a financial way is to hurt Indigenous people in a health way and in a cultural way.
Resource development can be the front lines for conflict. Gallagher says with the right roadmap that looks at consent and rights and royalties,
reconciliation in the resources sector is actually the easiest place to start because there's a goal and an incentive to make something work that will raise all boats.
despite court dates, even jail time, if they had to do it all over again.
I'll never regret doing that. I'll never regret that movement and that energy that we had when we went through the gate and occupied the camp.
I would have occupied longer until we had gotten what we wanted.
As long as there is a colonial government that's hell-bent on exploiting and destroying land and water and lives in Indigenous communities, then we will always have to continue to fight for this. So unless our colonial government is actually going to reconcile, is actually going to speak the truth, is actually going to do the things they claim to do, we're a long ways from being able to just enjoy our land and water and lives.
Here in Winnipeg, we've seen a rise in the number of babies that we are having to treat for opioid addiction that they experience in the womb.
I was 12 years old when I was introduced to crack.
Even to change a diaper, you'll see them shake like this.